I'm Michael Krasny, and I welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly podcast of deep dive interviews with national and international authors, journalists, tech and business experts, artists, scientists, entertainers, and opinion shapers. And you can become a member of this podcast simply by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. We cover a wide range of intellectually engaging and stimulating topics distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence. In this episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, I welcome best-selling author and veteran New York Times journalist Scott James, author of Trial by Fire, a major work on the Station nightclub tragic fire in Rhode Island, which took over 100 lives and also took over 15 years to solve and bring some accountability to. The recipients of 3 TV News Emmy Awards and author of 2 best-selling novels, Soma and The Sowers, Scott James is a New England native and a graduate of the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, and I welcome him. Good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah, pleased to have you. And let me just begin by talking with you about this horrible, tragic fire that you did such yeoman work on and such memorable work on. Jack Russell, Great White. It sounds like something out of a combining of a dog and, I don't know, Moby Dick, but it was a 90s metal band.
Yeah.
And right in your backyard, and one of the deadliest single building fires in U.S. history, still probably recorded as that, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it was really the deadliest fire since we had the invention of modern fire codes that were set up after the Beverly Hills Supper Club fire in the 70s. And after that, a lot of changes were made. And yet, this still happened in 2003. 100 people died, hundreds were injured.
And speaking of codes, had it actually gone through a fire code getting its approval? And
Sure. Yeah, no, there were many things that went wrong with this fire. In fact, probably a dozen things went wrong simultaneously. And if one of them had not happened, every single person would have survived. And a crucial one, which you mentioned, is that the place was given kind of an A-plus safety rating by the local fire marshal. And if he had done a better job, he would have discovered that the place was actually a death trap. But he didn't do his work, and a lot of people think that he should have been held accountable for making that mistake, but he wasn't. In fact, he was allowed to stay on the force. He was even promoted, and he retired with full benefits.
There are very disturbing nuances to this story, and like many of these tragic stories, there's also things that are really almost heroic, and indeed heroic in the real sense, but also very inspiring. I want to really flesh out the story with you, but what's the big lesson for you out of a fire like this, other than the fact that maybe you can't trust the fire marshals and you can't trust people when we're trying to put on a show, which is what they were doing, pyrotechnical show, really? Huh?
Right. Now, look, the takeaway that most people got is that they now check the exits. And I do too. When you go to a big event, how are you going to get out? How are you going to get out alive if something happens? And yet you still see these problems. We just had a terrible tragedy in North Macedonia where 61 people were killed, and it was almost identical to the Station nightclub fire. So we really can't count on society learning its lessons. So you're going to have to take charge of your own safety. And so I do look for the exit. A lot of people look for exits when they go. I went to a concert not that long ago to see Lizzo at the Bill Graham Auditorium down here in San Francisco. And I remember sitting there going, wow, this place is so packed and there are so few exits. I mean, it's an older venue. We would never all be able to get out alive. And that's today. We still have these issues and questions about our own safety. So that is probably the biggest takeaway for the most people. Individually, there's a lot to unpack as to what happened and what went wrong. We talked about many things. Another thing is that this building, the Station nightclub, did not have sprinklers. In this day and age, no sprinklers. Why? Because they weren't required, because it was quote unquote grandfathered in. And these things exist all over the place where a venue doesn't have to comply with the very latest codes because they would comply with the codes when they were built, which in this case could be the 30s and 40s and 50s. And they just never had to go back and put in safety measures. That exists all over the country.
Sadly enough, and we don't really know to what extent it's going to be remedied, particularly with all these cutbacks and what's going on in terms of government policy, but we won't necessarily have to explore that. What I wanted to explore with you right initially, you mentioned A+. I give you an A+ for the book and what you were able to do as an investigative journalist and just the narrative power of the book. Somebody compared you to Agatha Christie, I think, which is high praise for any journalist who's writing a book. When you write like a novelist, I used to tell journalists who wrote like novelists, in terms of high praise, that was what they were able to accomplish. And then I realized, I'm not necessarily suggesting they're writing fiction when I say they write like a novelist, because you write fiction as well. This is just really good, hardcore journalism. And what really became famous in this story was it was all captured on TV. I mean, millions were able to see it because that was just sort of an accident, wasn't it?
Well, look, this is 2003. This is well before the invention of the smartphone, the iPhone, anything like that. Today, we're so used to, with doorbell cameras and everything, seeing tragedies happen in front of our eyes on video. But that never happened in 2003. And in fact, ironically enough, inside the club that night was a local TV news crew that was doing a story on public venue safety. You just can't make this up. So the story had already been shot. They were shooting what's called B-roll, which is like generic footage that's going to go over the story. They got their pictures of people having a good time, ordering their drinks, getting ready for the show. And the photographer was done. But he decided, you know what, I'm going to stick around. I'm going to roll tape as this band comes on stage because I think the guys back at the TV station will get a kick out of seeing this. So the video, the camera's rolling as the band takes the stage. The first thing they do is light off some pyrotechnics, basically 15-foot pyrotechnics in a nightclub that only had 12-foot ceilings. The place catches on fire. Nobody moves for the first 30 seconds because they all think it's part of the show. You know, how dramatic. Look at those flames surrounding the stage. Well, it turns out that from the time of the spark until when the place is fully engulfed is only 90 seconds. And that was one of the other twists of this story, something that happened. The place had been covered in this sound foam, which, as Michael, as you know from working in studios your whole life, is supposed to be, safe, flame retardant. But the sound foam that was used in this club was highly flammable packing foam. So it went up like solid gasoline. All of this is captured on videotape from the inside. So, and by a professional news crew. So you can count on like two things previously in memory, like the Hindenburg disaster and 9/11, where the disasters were actually captured on professional news videotape. So that happened in this case. And because of that notoriety, this went from being a local story or even a national story to one that was seen all over the world. I think it's fair to say that hundreds of millions of people saw that footage because it was just so unusual.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary story, and it's extraordinary in so many ways. Getting back to what you said earlier, the accountability part of it is, no charges, civil or criminal, for quite some time.
Yeah, no, they never had a trial. And so things were eventually settled, either in the criminal case or in the civil case. And so there was never a laying out of all the facts of the story of what had happened. And so that's where it comes to me, and that's how it lands on my plate. I'm from there. This is really the worst thing that ever happened where I grew up. And I was out here in California when it happened. And so, like everyone else, I watched it on TV, on CNN, that terrible footage. And there was something odd that happened that night that always stuck in my mind at the fire scene before basically any investigation had happened. In fact, they didn't even know what happened. What I'm telling you now is the facts of the story. None of those were known. They didn't even know how many people were dead. The local police chief decided to say who was guilty on TV, which I thought, well, that's really, how do you say who's going to face criminal charges and who's responsible when you have done zero investigation? So that was odd, but it's Rhode Island. Rhode Island is a notoriously corrupt state, and so I just kind of moved on.
But excuse me, even in Rhode Island, you're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty.
That's a good question. Look, so I would come back and see my family and friends, and they would say, we never got the full story of what happened there. And they were really correct because the facts had never been laid out. All you really got was the government side of the story, and in some cases, a kind of a media spin on what they thought the story was. But nobody had gone through all the evidence, all the documents. And I was very fortunate because from the time of the fire until when I started working on it, the secret grand jury testimony was made public. And so there were thousands and thousands and thousands of documents of people speaking on the record. These were contemporaneous interviews. I mean, some of them happened within days of the grand jury was set within days of this fire. And so people, it was fresh in their minds. I didn't have to go back 10 years later and say, what do you remember? It was all there, written down. So that was, as you can imagine, a treasure trove of information. But because it had come out years after the actual incident, the local media they didn't have the resources to go through it. I had the time to go through all the pages and study what happened and look at the inconsistencies. In this case, only 3 people were criminally charged. So basically, the roadie manager, the guy who actually set off the explosives, and the 2 nightclub owners.
Brothers.
One of them wasn't even in town. Yeah, the brothers, the Didarian brothers. And one of them was in Florida at the time of the tragedy. But they were both criminally charged. And that was it. And a lot of people wondered, why not that fire marshal? Why not the band? Why not the lead singer of the band who ordered these things? There were a lot of questions. Why not the guy who provided them with the foam? There was an order form where they asked for sound foam, which is safe. They got packing foam, which is not. What about that guy? How come he wasn't held accountable? So there was a lot of that. And so, yeah, there were a lot of unanswered questions, which I tried to answer. And this book took the better part of 10 years. As you know, Michael, books take a long time to do, but also you have to pitch it and write a proposal and then write it, finish it, market it. I mean, this is a big chunk of time that most people would never have to do.
But the book did get, as it deserved, a good deal of attention. And you brought up the whole idea of journalistic empathy, which I was struck by, the ability to listen and tell a story and tell it in the right way. Although I can't help thinking sometimes about the antithesis of that with Janet Malcolm. You have to get people who are closed-mouthed also to open up and trust you. And that's a whole different kind of rumba, so to speak.
It took years, absolute years. So one of the people who was criminally charged, this guy, Jeffrey Didarian, I knew him because he used to be a TV reporter. In fact, he was an employee of mine early in his career. I was his boss. So you would think that because I knew him way back when, that it would have been an easy get, right? That he would talk to me, but that was not the case. First of all, I'm not sure that I was the best boss. I don't think his memories are all very happy with regard to me. But, he did not trust me, and I had to earn that trust. And that actually took over probably a couple of years to make that happen. And then he introduced me to his brother, who, of course, doesn't know me at all. And then even when they agreed to do it, honestly, it took a long time to get them to be revealing. They had their guard up. Some of it was psychological. I think Jeffrey was inside the fire when it happened. He saw things he can never unsee. Some of them you can see in the video, and once you see it, you will never get it out of your head. But he was there. He was inside. So he's traumatized and probably has PTSD, but there are parts of that night that are complete blacks. He can't remember any of it. Now, there are stories about what people saw him doing, but he can't recall it. And in fact, it was fascinating to me that when we finally got him to remember what he could remember, he had not shared this with anyone, even his wife, even his psychiatrist who tried to help him get past these things. He had never spoken about it. And so he shared that with me, and that became a key part of the book.
Well, you're speaking about bosses. Jean Carstensen was a boss of yours, and I just interviewed her recently at a special event in Sebastopol here in Northern California, and she's written an extraordinary book about a tragedy of a ship that was coming over with migrants on it. It was supposed to hold about maybe a couple dozen people, and there were hundreds on it, and it was in the Aegean, and it off of Lesbos sank, and hundreds of people died. Another terrible tragedy, although, again, heroic actions and community coming together and all of that. But I was struck in that by just the sense in the story that you tell and the story that she tells about how communities do come together, and how in the wake of some of these horrible tragedies, there's heroic actions. In her story, there are people on jet skis saving lives, getting survivors out of harm's way, even though so many were dying. And there are heroic stories in this too as well.
Well, I think there are a couple of things that you can compare between these two books. First of all, the day of, there are heroic actions. In her book, Amazing Rescues. And in my book, I mean, you had people running into that fire. Imagine that. And pulling people out. Some of them never came back out when they tried to go in and help people. So, but then over time, you have a certain anger, you have some bitterness. You know what I liked about Jean's book, and I think we both approached our subjects in the same way. We told them as narrative nonfiction, or you'd like to say the nonfiction novel. They read like novels. And the way you accomplish that is you pick a handful of people to represent the many. So she's got about 6 people she follows. I've got about 6 people that we follow.
Actually, mainly 4 in her case.
You get to get into people's heads, right? You get to have empathy for them because you're seeing things through their eyes. So the bitterness comes when who's going to be held accountable? I mean, the poor people on that island, there's very few people that live there, and yet she said there were tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who were kind of dumped on their doorstep to deal with. So there was some resentment about that. In fact, in the long term, it's no longer a welcoming place. They put up the walls and sometimes are accused of violence in order to keep those refugees from landing on that island again. And there was bitterness and anger in the story that I covered with the nightclub fire tragedy. These poor people, most of them were working class. This is a roadside dive bar, basically, that had a lot of washed-up bands that making a revival. They were famous for their tribute bands, like Shania Twin would be one of the type of things they would do. So these are real. This wasn't a highbrow. This was not the opera. This was working class people out to have a good time. It was a big party place. People, because it's connected to being a tragedy, people forget that people go out and have a good time. They drink, they do drugs, all those things. These are rockers. What they weren't were people with any clout. When you're a waitress or you move furniture for a living, you don't have the ability to really advocate for yourself in a meaningful way, not in the politics of the time. And so pretty shortly after this tragedy, these people were largely abandoned to kind of take care of themselves. The traditional charities that we think of that would come to the rescue with something like this, they didn't, because rock and rollers who do drugs and party are not as sympathetic as kids with cancer. So if you're going to spend your money, you don't spend it on them. FEMA turned their back on them. They didn't help the communities at all, even though they were completely devastated. They had helped in other states, very similar tragedies. They had stepped in, but not this one. So they were abandoned and they had to fend for themselves. And that's kind of one of the inspirational parts of the story, to be honest, is how that groups of survivors created a fund to help other survivors. And they were successful at that and really made a difference. But think of that. They had to fend for themselves while they are recovering from horrific trauma or physical injuries.
This brings up something else in my mind. I read an article you did in Psychology Today about people who feel, well, that something's been stolen from them, a loved one. And they become even more bitter because justice is not rendered, or there's no sense of, I think the word closure is promiscuously overused, in my own opinion, but there's no sense of bringing things to some resolve or resolution. And this article really moved me, as did your writing about the fire in Rhode Island, because your mother at 80 was in the hospital, was essentially dying. And here you were, an influential journalist, someone who did have, a high, so we say, public profile. And you couldn't get anybody really to act about, the guy was driving on the wrong side of the road.
Yeah. She was killed.
She was killed ultimately, yeah. Murdered, really. And there you are living with that sense of, my mother was murdered and, I can't get justice. You said, I think at one point, Dateline was spending its time about a young woman who's texting as opposed to a senior citizen, and that kind of encapsulates it beautifully.
Yeah. Now, look, at the time that my mother was killed, it was the time of that story with the young woman who was texting her boyfriend, and he committed suicide, right. And they decided to hold her accountable for his death. It was a real interesting way to spin on the law. But the Bristol County District Attorney's Office, which was in charge of trying that case, That was the same office that would have handled my mother's case, and they did absolutely nothing. But, you know, I did, Michael, I stuck with it. I went and sat in the lobby and did not move until they agreed to see me. And that's kind of when they explained to me that they screwed the whole thing up. That my mother's death was never reported to them, so therefore they didn't investigate.
Well, excuse me, it was reported as minor injuries originally, wasn't it?
Correct. The police report was like, it made it seem like everybody walked away and was just fine. Part of the thing in New England is, it's hard for us in here in California to understand it, is the states are small. And so my mother, basically the accident, or I'm not accident, the collision happened in Massachusetts on the Rhode Island border. The hospital was in Providence, Rhode Island. So they would say their excuse was, look, she died in Rhode Island. The collision happened in Massachusetts, and both sides were not talking to each other, and that's how the ball was dropped. It's kind of a specious argument because my older brother, who's a retired police officer, he was involved, and he made sure that everybody knew what had happened on both sides of the border, and they did nothing. I think they were distracted by chasing headlines for themselves, which they certainly got.
I'm talking with Scott James, author of Trial by Fire, among many other books and articles. And really, when I think about what you went through with your mother, it's just so painful to... but you also write about the importance of making villains human. Why? Why is that so important?
Well, because there are no villains in this story. There's no guy with a mustache and waxing the edges of it. There's no villains here. I think that people try to make a villain. I mean, I think we should be careful every time there's a tragedy and you have a public official who comes out before knowing the facts and says, well, somebody has to pay for this. Somebody's got to pay for this. Well, maybe, but maybe it's actually the system that is a failure. I think in the case of the nightclub fire, the system failed these poor people in so many ways. So failed to protect them. I often wonder when people say, well, who is to blame for this tragedy? And I'm like, well, kind of us. We set up these systems of government. We elect these people to these positions, and they don't do their jobs. So, you know, yes, they might be particularly to blame, but the fact is that we like the fact that we can go to a roadside dive and pay a little bit of money to see some band and have a good time. Well, the little bit of money means that place, maybe is running on the edge of things, and they don't have the money to put in those sprinklers, even though it's not required by law. And I think the nightclub owners were held accountable criminally because they didn't go above and beyond what was expected of them, which is really kind of a lame excuse for criminal charges.
Didn't you run into some problem with, I think, I mentioned the name here, it's probably maybe a bête noire of yours, but Tracy Breton,
who
was a faculty member at Brown and also wrote for the Providence newspaper, a reporter, thought you weren't doing things legally, or what was the problem there?
Well, there was an issue where one of the brothers, his kids, she mentioned something. She was trying to get them to do the interview, basically the interview that I got with them. She wanted to be the first person to talk to them, and they put them off for a long time. They basically hated the Providence Journal, the two brothers, because they felt that they had been treated unfairly. And so one of the brothers said to me that at one point she implied, or they believed she implied, that if they did not play ball and do an article, an interview with her, that she was going to do an article about their children. Well, you know, all these people lost parents, and here these people, their parents are out and about and still surviving. Now, she never wrote that story, and we don't know exactly what she said, but it was worth exploring that as part of the book. So I wanted to ask her questions, which is obviously the fair thing to do, to say, well, what's your side of this story? And as soon as I asked the question, she started threatening me. So here he is, she's accused of threatening these people to try to get a story, and she's telling me I never threaten people, and then she's threatening me. She threatens to go to the publisher. You know, Michael, it's a tough time to be a journalist. People or institutions that we used to count on to do the fight, publishing houses, newspapers, they're caving under the pressure of threats of lawsuits. And she certainly knew this as a journalism professor at Brown University. So she tried that, and Thank goodness my publisher did not cave, and they didn't, what we reported was fair and accurate. But imagine that. And the foolish thing is, she did it in a voicemail. So it was one of those things where later when she said, well, I never did any of that, I just released the voicemail through one of the local media outlets. So foolish to do that. She probably could have handled that a lot better. But the Providence Journal was very aggressive with the people here. Not the roadie, by the way, who set off the explosives that killed everybody. They didn't hold him accountable in the papers, but they really went after the brothers who owned the nightclub very aggressively, and some would say very unfairly.
They made a plea bargain, didn't they?
Yes. I think that people say, I would never take a plea bargain if I wasn't guilty. Well, people who say that have never faced the full force of the government coming after them. The brothers were told that even if they got a hung jury, that they would simply keep trying them over and over again. They split the trial into two so they couldn't share the resources of just fighting one. So they faced the prospect of having 4 trials at the very minimum before they could even get off. The other thing was there was polling that they did. It was really interesting because they had been so demonized in the media. Polling of prospective jurors showed that even if evidence was presented at trial that completely exonerated them, they would still find them guilty because, quote, somebody needed to be held accountable.
Somebody has to pay. Yeah.
Somebody has to pay. And so you're looking at that. You're looking at basically many possible years in prison if you're convicted. So they took a plea bargain. The plea bargain is really interesting because basically they were accused of killing 100 people. But in the end, only one of them went to jail and was sentenced to like the equivalent of 18 months. Who gets 18 months for killing 100 people? And so yeah, that was an interesting plea bargain. Would you take it? Would I take it? It's a great question to ask. But in this case, I think they felt they had no choice. They had families to support. They had, responsibilities. So one of the odd twists in the story was when they finally came down to the plea bargain deal, the prosecutors basically said, one of you is going to have to go to jail as part of this plea bargain, and you need to decide which one it's going to be. And so there's a scene in the book where they're at a Dunkin' Donuts, because everybody goes to Dunkin' Donuts out there. But they went there with their wives because they didn't want to do this in the house where the kids might overhear what was going on. And that's where they hash it out as to which one of them is going to go serve time and which one's going to stay at home and work and try to take care of the families. And they make a decision. And honestly, they make the wrong decision. And things go a little bit haywire from there. So far from being the settled and everyone's going to try to move on, it gets worse.
It has kind of Cain and Abel resonance to it, in fact, doesn't it,
right.
In some ways? Big lesson for you as someone who has 3 Emmy Awards for TV news in terms of the coverage of this and the way the media responded to it. There were many lessons, I'm sure, but maybe we could do a little triage here and find out what was more significant or conspicuous to you. I mean, I'm struck by the fact that 48 Hours, for example, did an immense amount of coverage of this story.
Yeah, no, they basically adapted the book for television. But what's interesting was the book came out in October 2020. So this is during the pandemic. So there was no ability to do appearances, to really promote the book as you would in a traditional book launch way. And so 48 Hours got a copy of the book. Because I'd worked in media, I knew some people who work in the media and had got the book under the right noses, and it got passed along to 48 Hours. It was really kind of a heady experience. The book was given to a producer there like on a Thursday morning, and Thursday after midnight, his time, he's calling me and telling me they want to do it as an episode. But it's the pandemic. You can't really do anything. We heard these stories about, movie productions and TV productions and how difficult it was. Well, it really was. It was kind of crazy. So because so many of the people in my book are kind of immune compromised because they're burn survivors, they couldn't do, just a regular sit-down interview. So in Rhode Island, they rented a ballroom at a hotel. And down in one corner was the victim, and down the other corner was the correspondent. And everyone else in between looked like in hazmat suits, because that's what people were doing at that time. So they do the interview, and through the magic of television, it looked like they were talking to each other. And then after the interview, the entire place would have to be disinfected, and then they do another interview. Well, this went on for a couple of weeks, and they were exhausted. They just never had to deal with something like this. So for me, I couldn't even get on a plane to go out there to do the interview because they were worried that, what if I got COVID on the plane? They would be responsible for me. And if I died, can you imagine? So they rented another ballroom type of place here, this 3-camera shoot on tons of lights set up. And there's me. Everyone else is in hazmat suits. And there's me. The only guy in the room who can't have one is the guy being interviewed. And for that, we did it through a remote. The interview was done that way. But through the magic of television, it looks like everybody's sitting in the same room. But because of these restrictions, the 48 Hours adaptation doesn't come out until 1 year after the book was published. Think of that. So, but then things really change. So it's one thing to do a book. As you know, Michael, books, maybe people don't know, books tend to sell fairly moderately. If a book sells tens of thousands of copies, it is a success. If it sells hundreds of thousands, it's a phenomenon. So, but the 48 Hours episode, the first airing of it, had 3.5 million viewers. And then it's been shown repeat that summer. And then they put it up on YouTube, where it had another 1.5 million views, and it's on streaming on Paramount Plus and all of that. Well, people's lives changed after the reporting went from being a book to the reporting being a television show. The brothers, who had been so demonized by the Providence Journal and other media, all of a sudden their lives changed. There were questions about whether they had been treated fairly. Some people even thought that they were exonerated by what the reporting when they finally got to see it. And in fact, they've moved on with their lives. The guy who used to be a TV reporter way back when, he is now a TV reporter again, even though you would think somebody like that being a high-profile crime would never work again in that industry. But he's working. He's doing stories just about every day for a TV station in Connecticut. Not Rhode Island, but in nearby Connecticut.
How was the reception in your backyard? Like I say, this is right where you grew up, and this is your world in terms of boyhood and all that. Were you looked at as someone who was telling a story that needed to be told, which is indeed what you did, or were you looked at to some extent as, here's this guy in California, gay writer,
Right.
talk to you about that as well, and they could stigmatize you in some ways, maybe not telling the story the right way. Did you get any of that?
Oh, certainly. It's interesting. People say they want the truth to come out. They want to know what the real story is. But when you tell them what the real story is, that doesn't mean they actually want to hear it. And so, there were people who were angry, even people who were in the book, which was kind of surprising. There was one of my central subjects who really, her story opens the book. It's the thread for the book. She is kind of the before, during, and after. She's one of the worst hurt, and she survived, and she was one who helped set up these funds to help others survive. She's an amazing person. We spent days together over the course of years. Part of my process, which was painful for the people who agreed to do it, was we would do an interview about a scene, basically, about something that happened. I would go home, I would write a draft, and then months later, not the next day, I would come in person and we would do a table read. So they didn't get it on paper ahead of time. They didn't get a chance to edit anything. And I would read it out loud to them, and they would say, well, Scott, that's good. Or they would say, actually, no, I wasn't wearing a red hat. I was wearing a purple hat or whatever. And we would go through and kind of make the edits. They had no control over what I wrote, but it was exhaustive. And there was a lot of crying. This was very emotional to relive those days over and over again. So the book comes out, and this person says, well, I didn't know I was in that book. I'm very surprised. I'm a prominent subject in that book. And I'm thinking, really? We sat and we cried at a table together for hours. So, there was some of that. And I think that for people who are part of this tragedy, they have a certain thing in their mind about what happened. And when somebody says it didn't, it's very upsetting. One of the classic examples, and this was in the newspaper, and even people tried to put it into court, was that one of the nightclub owners, Jeffrey Dedarian, who's there at the fire, who's in the fire, that instead of that during the fire, I mean, we know that it happens in seconds, not minutes, seconds, ran back into the nightclub and took the cash register out so he could have the money while he watched people burn alive all around him. Well, that never happened. That never happened at all. But people have told this story over and over and over again. So here I come and say, well, here's what happened. They're like, no, you get it totally wrong. What about the guy who ran in to save the money instead of saving people? You're not going to change their mind about that. Doesn't matter the testimony, the evidence, things that are on video. In their mind, that's what happened. So another thing that didn't happen was there was a guy standing near the stage door. He was a bouncer. His job was to keep the door closed while the bands were playing because of the noise bothered the neighbors. Somehow they decided he was standing at that door and deciding who would live and who would die. And he decided if you were famous, you would live. If you were not famous, you would die. Well, nothing like that happened. We're talking about seconds that go by. Was he standing in front of the door? Yes. Was it his job to make sure the door was closed? Yes. But when the fire happens, it actually happens between him and the door because it's the stage door. There's a wall of flames. People didn't get out that door because they couldn't, not because this guy pointed at people and said, you will live and you will die. And that man lost his wife in the fire, and yet he was seen as a villain. And people still see him as a villain, even though it's not true. So here I come along saying, these things that you widely believe are not true. And so, yeah, there's some people who absolutely hate me for doing that.
And sometimes those stories that you talk about are illustrative of how the media operates, because they want to get clickbait, they want to get interest of readers, they want to sell more newspapers. And unfortunately, I don't mean to be wholesaling an indictment about the media. There's too much ease in doing that. But you talked before about demonization, for example, and there was a lot of that.
Yeah, no, look, there was a Harvard professor, and I have to say shame on him, who wrote an op-ed for the Providence Journal, and they published it, so shame on them, where he basically gave validity to some of those stories I just told you about. The running in, getting the cash register, like he was there. He wasn't, but he saw an opportunity to get his name in the paper and have a comment, and so just a disgrace, and that happened all the time.
So as a longtime news guy, I mean, I wonder how you feel about all the changes we're going through now with all this talk about fake news from the Trump administration, but also AI playing a preeminent role now and more of a role, maybe even hegemonic in some ways.
Well, look, I think AI is going to turn out to be a useful tool when people figure out how to make it work. I was thinking the other day about how that one of the things that happened with the collapse of the traditional news media, and that happened because for a lot of different reasons, financial mostly, news organizations do not have the ability to fund proper coverage of the news. I mean, when we were growing up, people actually were assigned to go to the town council meetings and report on what happened. Well, nobody is doing that. So here's an example. Maybe AI analyzes the recordings of those meetings because they are recorded. They're often broadcast on local cable TV, and it identifies for the human editors, well, here's something that was said that, maybe we should look into or that was newsworthy. So I think there are going to be some practical applications of this, but we're just not there yet. But it certainly could be a big aid. Look, some of the things that people write about that are, just take a lot of time, but they don't really change is, the stock market. Somebody's reporting their profits or whatever. AI can do that, summarize it in a paragraph. One of the things I did when I was just starting out in journalism is I had a summer internship at a local newspaper, and I would have to write the wedding announcements. And I didn't even know what a white organza gown was, but I certainly learned very quickly. That's the type of thing that could be sent, the wedding announcement, to the paper, and AI could put it into the format. It's all just a format so that it ended up being in the newspaper. So some things could be helpful, but right now we just don't know.
It also brings up some real questions about differences between fiction and nonfiction. And you've written a couple of novels, bestsellers. In fact, I think it becomes a bestseller if it's on the best-selling list in San Francisco or San Jose. I had some bestsellers too. It looks, if it's a big city and it gets on the bestseller list, you get that.
Sure.
You get anointed with that. But there's a sense now that sometimes the line is very thin between stories that are fictional or half-baked or come from not exactly valid sources. I mean, you wrote a couple novels. Actually, I want to talk to you about your novels, but you wrote them under an anonymous name.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, it was really not kind of to deceive. It was more like Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens. That was my concept. So I needed to keep my real identity as a journalist. So I used my name, Scott James. And so for fiction, I used the name Kemble Scott, which is a completely made up name, because I wanted to delineate, at least in my head, like if I'm Scott James, I'm telling you the truth. If I'm Kemble Scott, I am lying to you because I'm doing fiction. But I realize now that was probably a terrible idea to do it that way, because it was a distinction more for me than it was for the audience. I was never in hiding. I did all my public appearances. There was my face and all that stuff. It's not a J.T. Leroy situation at all. So, and then later when I started writing for the New York Times, I thought, oh, wow, I should never have used that pen name, because people could look me up and maybe they'd show some interest in those novels if they could connect it with the guy who was writing for the newspaper. So if I write another novel, I will write it under my real name. And if I reissue the other novels, I will change it to my real name. So it wasn't a type of hide. But I will say this about the novels. They taught me how to write a book, because I understood about plot. I understood about how to do a thread. I understood about pacing. All of these things, they all add up to our experiences in life. And I could not have written Trial by Fire, which is like a nonfiction novel. I could never have done it if I hadn't done those two books. It would have been too intimidating. And so once you do one, you are not intimidated.
Wasn't your second novel also released digitally?
It was. It was the first book published on a format called Scribd, but it was also a very early ebook, really before they became really famous. Probably the first ebook that really took off. They were almost all genre. So you look at like E.L. James and her 50 Shades of Grey. Part of the reason that book was so popular was that you could read it on an iPad and nobody saw what you were reading. So think about that. Here's you're at the beach and you're reading this kind of racy book. If it was a book, everyone would know when they walked by, like, look at that person, shame on them for reading that book. But nobody knows what you're reading when you're on an iPad. So clever. But what I did do with my first book was I was the first author to launch a book using YouTube, which was an interesting experience. And only because my downstairs neighbor had started working for this startup that nobody had ever heard of. And she knew I had a book coming out. And she said, you should try to do it on our website. Do something on our website. I said, well, what's your website? She said, what's YouTube? Like, I never heard of it. No one had. So I did some videos to promote the book. And the book comes out. And the book was a little bit edgy, a little racy, I guess you could say. The videos were not as racy. And somebody, I think it was TechCrunch, basically wrote about the phenomenon of an author doing these videos to promote a book. And they said, well, he's very misleading because those videos are nowhere near as dirty as the book. Well, the book became a bestseller the next week.
That was a kiss of certainty for its success to get that.
Right, it's like Banned in Boston is a great badge of honor.
Yeah, Banned in Boston, that's right. And Soma is really a very parodic book in many ways. I mean, you're making fun of a lot of people and clearly having a good time writing it. There's a lot of, I suppose, erotic stuff, but erotic in the neurotic sense as well. There's a lot of humor. Did you realize you have comedic gifts as well when you started writing?
Well, it's interesting thinking about recently about who were the people who were books that were influential for me. And as a young person, probably in high school, I read a lot of Kurt Vonnegut. I think the books that inspired me probably was that. And so, yeah, I do think there's that. Look, Selma, set in South of Market, San Francisco, people wanted to believe that it was some sort of accounting of my own life. But the fact is that every chapter in that book takes you to a different part of the weirdness of San Francisco. And everything in that book has happened, but it did not happen to me. And so I would show up at these readings, and I would show up in my khaki pants, my button-down blue shirt. And they'd be like, who are you? Like, why when we wrote this book? They're like, I really expected to see someone who had crawled out from under a rock. So so that was an interesting experience, and yeah, I had some fun with it. Absolutely.
And you got nominated for a National Lambda Award, and I think we're a finalist in that. What about being a gay author? I mean, with fiction and with journalism, puts a label on you to some degree, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think, but times have changed. When I started working in journalism, I could not be out, and if I had been out, I would have been fired, no question. Starting in the '80s, you couldn't be out. And I remember an interesting person who I went to journalism school with, Kara Swisher, who's quite popular and influential now at writing about tech. She said recently the same thing, that she could not have been out at the very earliest parts of her career. I think part of it was to be gay and pronounce you were gay in the '80s meant you were an advocate, an activist, something like that. I also think it was became the height of the AIDS crisis, and then it was very hard not to be an advocate or an activist when your community is basically being victims of a type of genocide. And so I get it. I get why people would have been concerned. But yeah, that type of discrimination lasted well into the '90s. I remember there was an editor at the Providence Journal, because we were working in the same market, who came out late in life, left his wife, and they took him from being a serious editor, top editor, to putting him on the lifestyle page, because he's gay. He can't work in real news. So let's get him covering garden parties or something like that. And that was a wake-up call for me. It's like, wow.
So you experienced what is often described as homophobia to a great degree?
Oh, there's no question about it. I don't know that I personally suffered, because I was so far in the closet at that point that I didn't make it an issue. But look, there was a guy at a TV station across the street, a competing station. He was a news director just like me. News directors are kind of like the Lou Grant of the newsroom, the guy who's in charge. And he was openly gay, and he got a job at the MTV networks. I think it was, I can't remember which channel it was, to go and work there and run something. And the local newspaper, the Providence Journal, again, said, well, he's better suited for that type of work, in the article about his departure. We know what they were saying. So yes, we saw it all the time. But look, when I started working in TV news, it was still completely acceptable for the male anchor to say that women have no business being in this business. And that was a perfectly acceptable thing to say in the 1980s, which wasn't that long ago.
Well, in fact, you had Dan Rather sort of making sure that there wasn't a woman anchor alongside him, and those kinds of things were just commonplace. When did you decide, or why did you decide to come out of the closet?
I think when I moved here to San Francisco, so this is really, I'm in my 30s at this point, and I was always out to a small circle of people. I mean, I wasn't, I had a gay community that I became part of when I got here. But honestly, when I met the person who would become my husband, and I remember lying to my father because I had gone to a Giants game and my husband was part of a group that sang the national anthem. And I mentioned that my dad was a former ball player, a minor league ball player, and we're talking about the game. And I'm editing my conversation. So I'm not saying what was really the most exciting thing for me at that game, which was seeing my boyfriend at the time sing the national anthem. And I thought, this is wrong. And so I got on an airplane and flew out to see my family in person to tell them. And of course, it was at that point a big non-event. They were like, well, of course we knew. I mean, I hadn't dated women since like the early 90s. So yeah, they figured it out. And so, but for me, even at that age, it was quite emotional. It's really interesting coming out stories. It often involves a lot of tears and a lot of emotion. And I know it's very difficult for some people, and not every family is accepting. But there is an emotional thing to doing it. I think kids today are very lucky that they don't have to go through that, although I think many still do.
Harvey Milk was a central figure in helping a lot of people come out of the closet. I mean, a lot of credit is due to him.
Certainly. He really put himself out there, and of course he was murdered because he did.
He was murdered also because of the enmity that existed between him and Dan White, and an understandable enmity in many ways with the Moscone killing, and just the horror of that story, which we don't have to dig up again. But when you dig up a story as a journalist, as opposed to a story, comes out of your imagination when you're, satirizing Madonna and Rick Warren and so forth.
Right.
Can you speak about what gives more satisfaction? I mean, journalism or fiction?
Fiction and books have a long tail, which is really interesting. And of course, newspaper stuff does not. Basically, it's almost forgotten the next day. I think the one exception to that, and this I did find incredibly satisfying and unusual. I worked in TV news my whole career up until when I'd taken a break to do the novels, and then I ended up working for the New York Times. So the New York Times was really my first job writing for a newspaper, which is a very obnoxious thing to say, but that is true. And so because it's the New York Times, I was just flabbergasted how things had such a bounce. If you wrote something there, it almost always meant something, and it became something. I broke a few stories that popped into the international consciousness and really changed people's lives. I did a story about a World War II vet who was never noted for his act of bravery because he was black. And that's just the way things were back in World War II. Black people were never allowed to be seen to be saving white people's lives. It just wasn't allowed. But he did. And I confirmed this with his white officer at the time, wrote it in the newspaper. And next thing you know, the Secretary of the Navy gets in an airplane, flies to California, does a ceremony to pin a medal on the guy's chest. He was in his 90s. That's the New York Times. At least it was. That's the type of influence they had to literally change the
It
course
was the
of history.
paper of record. Yeah, that's what it was called.
Well, I think to a certain extent it still is, but the record, how we do the record has really changed.
Well, you've been rather versatile in the kinds of things that you've written about. I found an old article you did on Julian Schnabel, for example. I thought that was interesting. I mean, here's Scott taking a foray into the art world and also, video world as well. I mean, you're a man of Renaissance man of many interests and things that you would pursue in your life, as well as additionally to journalism. And then found an article about Dee Dee Wilsey. I mean, there's been a lot of things that you've done that sort of move beyond any kind of categorization or any kind of.
Well, I think, Michael, it's the same for you. And isn't this what makes it so exciting is that you get to become a mini expert in whatever, or you try to be, whatever you're writing about at the time, or if you're doing a talk show. And so that challenge, not many people get that in their jobs. A lot of people in their jobs are doing the same thing over and over and over again. So yeah, it's definitely a treat to be able to do that. Look, when I went to journalism school in New York, basically, the city of New York was our playground as journalists. I mean, it's interesting as a student, there's no consequences. In other words, if you get it wrong, you're not going to get fired. So people asked me, they thought J school was so hard, it was so difficult. I'm like, really? I had the best time running around New York, asking a bunch of people I don't know a bunch of questions. To me, that was amazing and not a problem.
So some thoughts now about what's happened with Columbia? I mean, they've lost a lot of money, and they've certainly been in international news. The spotlight's been on them.
I think it's complex, and a lot of things, of course, can be correct simultaneously. I am very disappointed by what I consider to be kind of the blatant anti-Semitism that happened on campus. I'm also troubled by the fact that people might be censored and their views cannot be heard. It's one of those issues of being in a democracy is that we believe in free speech, even when the free speech is something we really disagree with. So I think they're in a difficult situation. I do think it's this $400 million that's being held back from them by the federal government. I think that actually has nothing to do with any of that stuff. I think that this is a retribution for being an elite institution that some people think that snub them and need to be taught a lesson. So there's a lot going on there. I am glad, to be honest, that the interim president is Claire Shipman, who comes from my neck of the woods. She was a TV news person for a long time. And if she's anything like the TV news people I know, she will be made of steel and I wouldn't mess with her. So that to me is an interesting development. Now, she's not there forever. She's a temporary person. But I would like to see her use some of that metal and stand up to the people who are kind of abusing the situation.
So you're going to be writing another novel? You got some of the characters in your first novel who appear in your second novel. These characters still in your craw, or your mental craw?
Well, it's interesting. I am starting a new novel after doing the big nonfiction book. I'm interested in getting back to doing a novel. And so, I'm at the beginnings of plotting it out. And once again, it will be something that draws from real things that are really happening, and I'll put them into a fictional context.
Well, you mentioned Vonnegut. He remains an influence in your unconscious as well as your ability to write
That's
fiction.
funny. I just reread one of his short stories. I can't remember the name of it exactly. Where now this is written in the 70s, where he takes the whole question of what we today call wokeness or DEI and takes it to this extreme level, basically that you cannot discriminate against people for any sort of handicap or anything like that. And so it ends up going to extreme where they have a guy who basically can't speak, anchoring the news, and he's supposed to be telling people about some horrific event coming their way, an Armageddon, to warn them, but nobody can understand what he's saying because that's his handicap. You can't understand him, but he's the guy who's in charge of telling people everything. So I think it's called Benjamin Harrison. I can't remember the name of it, but I remember that stuck in my mind, and I recently went back to it because I thought, somebody did this before. Oh, it was Vonnegut, and it was in the 70s. So interesting how he brought up these issues at a time when they were just not issues.
Well, he was also a satirist, and you write satire.
Well, look, Breakfast of Champions, you can look up, you can Google what the doodles are that he uses in the book. I won't say it here, but I remember thinking at the time, it's like, you can do that? You can say these things? You can draw little pictures like that and put them in a book? Fascinating.
I always remembered something Vonnegut said about writing of any kind, fiction or nonfiction. We've been talking about both because you have both under your belt. And he said, you got to write for strangers. I always remember that because to some extent, sometimes you're writing for yourself or you're writing for your close friend or your husband or wife or whatever. But he was saying in terms of really getting the message across and telling the story the best way, it's best to think of your audience as strangers.
Well, I think another way to put it, there's an expression called, based on what we're saying, maybe I shouldn't say it, but kill your mother. You can't write anything of value if you're thinking about how your friends or your family is going to be judging you. You're going to have you're going to put a struggle if you do that. So you've got to get these people out of your head. So yes, you've got to be writing for others, not for your immediate circle.
Well, it's always delightful to talk to you. And let me first of all thank all who have joined us for this special episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, and remind you that you can join the podcast simply by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. Let me also know your thoughts, reactions, and suggestions by emailing me at mkrasny@graymatter.show, and allow me to thank our exceptional Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team of Alex, Jeff, Chad, Shannon, and Colleen, and special thanks to Scott James. For all of us, I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.